The sun had yet to peek over the horizon when Tom Wilson stepped out of his farmhouse, the crisp morning air biting at his cheeks. He took a deep breath, savoring the familiar scent of dew-kissed grass and the faint aroma of hay. Running a farm was no easy task, and Tom had long since accepted that sleeping in was a luxury he couldn't afford. The animals didn't care if it was a weekend or a holiday. They needed to be fed, and the fields needed tending. Tom finished his coffee in 2 quick gulps, the bitter liquid warming him from the inside out. He grabbed his work gloves from the hook by the door and stepped outside, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. Today was going to be a busy one. He had planned to take the tractor out early to haul supplies from the other side of the property. But as he approached the barn, his plans came to an abrupt halt. There, parked directly in front of the barn doors, was a sleek, cherry-red sedan. The car's polished surface gleamed under the soft morning light, looking absurdly out of place against the dusty, weathered backdrop of the farm. Tom frowned, his brow furrowing as he walked around the car, checking to see if anyone was inside. It was empty. He glanced over at his neighbor's property, where a small guest house stood. His neighbor, Mike, had been renting it out through Airbnb for the past few years. Occasionally, one of Mike's guests would overstep their bounds, parking too close to Tom's land or blocking his access to the fields. But this was a whole new level of inconsideration. Tom shook his head, muttering under his breath as he made his way over to Mike's house. He knocked on the door, and after a moment, Mike appeared, looking apologetic before Tom even said a word. "Let me guess," Mike said, rubbing his temples. "The car." Tom just nodded, his arms crossed over his chest. Mike sighed. "I know exactly whose it is." Before Mike could call for her, the guest in question appeared at the top of the stairs. She was exactly the type Tom expected, blonde hair cut into a sharp bob, oversized sunglasses perched on her head despite the early hour, and an air of entitlement that practically radiated from her. She held a coffee in one hand and her phone in the other, barely acknowledging the 2 men standing in the doorway. "This about the car?" she asked, not even bothering with a greeting. Tom folded his arms. "Yeah, it's parked in front of my barn. I need to get my tractor out." The woman, Emily, as Tom would soon learn, took a slow sip of her coffee before shrugging. "I'll move it later." "Later?" Tom asked, his patience already wearing thin. "I don't know." "Later," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's just a barn, right? I'm sure whatever you need can wait." Tom glanced at Mike, who looked about as uncomfortable as a man could get. Mike had always been a reasonable neighbor, but there wasn't much he could do when a guest decided to act like this. "It's not waiting," Tom said firmly. "I need to move feed, and I need my equipment now." Emily rolled her eyes. "It's just 5 minutes. That's what people say when they mean an hour," Tom shot back. "Well, I'm on vacation," she said, as if that somehow justified blocking his access to his own barn. "I don't feel like dealing with this right now." Tom exhaled slowly, trying to keep his temper in check. He wasn't an unreasonable man, and he'd given her a chance to do the right thing. But she had made it clear that she had no intention of moving her car anytime soon. And if she wasn't going to respect his property, well, he had other ways of handling things. "Last chance," Tom said, his voice low and steady. "Move it now, or I'll move it for you." Emily let out a short laugh. "Yeah, right. What are you going to do? Tow it with your little tractor?" Tom tilted his head, a slow smile forming. "Something like that." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emily shaking her head, clearly thinking he was bluffing. Mike looked like he wanted to apologize, but also didn't want to get caught in the crossfire. By the time Tom reached the barn, a plan had fully formed in his mind. It just so happened that he had something readily available, something Emily had probably never had to deal with in her polished city life. He glanced at the massive pile of manure that had been gathered over the past few weeks. If she wasn't going to move the car, maybe he'd just give it a little decoration. Grinning, Tom hopped onto his front loader and fired up the engine. The machine rumbled to life, sending a satisfying vibration through the worn seat beneath him. With practiced ease, he maneuvered the loader toward the manure pile, a pungent mountain of animal waste that had been accumulating for weeks. The recent rains had left the lower layers particularly wet and ripe, making it the perfect ammunition for his plan. As the front loader's bucket sank into the heap, Tom took a moment to appreciate the poetic justice of it all. Emily had dismissed his barn like it was some useless storage shed, as if the work he did here wasn't important. Well, She was about to learn firsthand just how much a barn and its contents could impact her day. Lifting the loaded bucket, Tom rolled toward her pristine red sedan. The contrast was almost comical, the sleek, polished car against the rugged backdrop of his farm. With a steady hand, he tilted the bucket forward. The manure fell in slow motion, a thick, sludgy cascade splattering across the windshield, the hood, and the roof with a glorious squelching sound. The force of it sent a few particularly large clumps rolling down the sides, where they stuck to the doors like nature's worst glue. Tom sat back, admiring his work. But then he noticed something. He hadn't quite covered the trunk. That wouldn't do. Whistling to himself, he backed up, scooped another load, and went in for round two. This time, he dumped the manure directly onto the rear, ensuring the trunk was just as inaccessible as the front. He even made sure some of it slid down into the gap where the rear window met the body of the car, just for good measure. The finishing touch, using a pitchfork, he carefully spread a few well-placed heaps over the door handles. If Emily wanted to get inside, she was going to have to get her hands dirty. Satisfied, Tom parked the front loader back by the barn and strolled away, whistling as he went back to his work. Now, it was just a matter of waiting. About an hour later, Tom's patience was rewarded. A piercing shriek rang out across the farm, loud enough to startle a few nearby cows. Tom stepped out from the barn just in time to see Emily standing next to her car, her hands in her hair, her designer sneakers sinking into the dirt. Her face was twisted in horror as she gawked at the mess covering her once spotless sedan. The manure had dried slightly in the sun, turning it into a thick, crusty layer over the car's surface. Tom leaned against the barn door, arms crossed, thoroughly enjoying the show. "You animal," Emily screeched, her voice shrill enough to scare off a few birds. She stomped toward him, her steps squelching in the mud. Tom barely lifted an eyebrow. "Something wrong. You did this on purpose." She gestured wildly at her car, her expensive manicure dangerously close to touching her manure-covered door handle. "Well," Tom said, pushing his hat back on his head, "I did warn you I'd move it for you." Emily gaped at him, momentarily speechless. "You're insane. You're going to clean this up, or I'm calling the cops." Tom shrugged. "Hose is right over there." He pointed to the side of the barn. "Help yourself." Mike had emerged from his house by now, arms crossed as he watched the scene unfold with barely concealed amusement. A few of Tom's other neighbors had also started to gather, leaning against fences or peeking out from their porches, sensing that something entertaining was going down. Emily fumed, spinning toward Mike. "Are you seriously just going to let him get away with this?" Mike gave her a sympathetic look, though the corner of his mouth twitched in what was very clearly an attempt not to laugh. "You did kind of park in front of his barn," he said with a casual shrug. "I told you it wasn't a good idea." Emily's nostrils flared as she turned back to her car, clearly weighing her options. She didn't have many. The nearest town was a good 20-minute drive away, and her car was now undrivable, unless she was willing to sit inside a portable stink bomb. Desperate, she yanked on the driver's side door handle, only to immediately recoil with a horrified gag. The manure had stuck to the metal, seeping into the crevices, and now it was all over her fingers. The noise she made was somewhere between a shriek and a wail as she frantically wiped her hands on her overpriced leggings. Mike let out a muffled snort, and one of the neighbors coughed, which didn't quite hide the laughter bubbling up from their chest. Emily was fuming now, her face red and splotchy with rage. She tried the trunk next, hoping to at least grab her bags, but that was just as futile. The manure had formed an effective seal over the keyhole, and there was no way she was getting in without getting a whole lot messier. Defeated, she turned back to Mike. "I'm leaving," she snapped. "And I want a full refund for this disgusting experience." Mike, who had probably dealt with his fair share of entitled guests, merely shrugged. "Sorry, but the listing says no refunds for guest negligence." Emily let out a sound that was pure frustration, then stomped toward the house, slamming the door behind her. Tom, still leaning against the barn, tipped his hat in satisfaction. He had a feeling that was the last time she'd be blocking anyone's barn doors. By noon, the entire town had heard about what had happened. It started with Mike telling a couple of his buddies at the general store. From there, it spread like wildfire. By the time Tom walked into the local diner for lunch, it was all anyone could talk about. He hadn't even sat down before someone clapped him on the back. "Heard you gave one of them city folks a proper welcome." said Hank, the owner of the hardware store, grinning from ear to ear. Not my fault she didn't take me seriously, Tom said, taking a sip of his coffee. Across the diner, a group of old-timers were chuckling over a picture someone had taken of Emily's car, completely covered in manure. The once shiny red paint was barely visible underneath. Someone had uploaded it to the town's Facebook group, and the comments were pure gold. Looks like she got herself a custom paint job, one comment read. She wanted to park in front of the farm. She got the full farm experience, another added. Next time, we should introduce her to the joys of pig slop, a third chimed in. Tom wasn't much for social media, but even he had to admit that the reaction was entertaining. The sheriff himself even stopped by, shaking his head in amusement. Heard about what you did, he said, leaning on the counter. Got to say, that's one creative way to handle things. Tom shrugged. Didn't damage her car. Just made sure she learned a lesson. The sheriff chuckled. I suppose that's one way to put it. He tipped his hat before heading back out, but not before muttering, bet she won't be back anytime soon. He was right about that. A few days later, Mike stopped by Tom's farm, looking like he was holding back laughter. You're going to love this, he said, handing Tom his phone. It was Emily's Yelp review. The woman had taken to the internet to rant about her horrific experience at Mike's Airbnb, claiming that she had been attacked by a deranged farmer and that the entire property smelled like a sewage plant. She even warned future guests that they would be subjected to primitive, borderline hostile conditions. Mike scrolled down to the comments section, where things had not gone the way Emily had probably hoped. Lady, you parked in front of a barn. What did you think would happen? One comment read. I'd pay extra for this kind of entertainment, another added. This is why country folks don't like city people showing up unannounced, a third chimed in. Mike laughed. She took it down after about an hour. Guess she wasn't getting the sympathy she wanted. Tom smirked. Figures. What was even funnier was that Mike had since updated his Airbnb listing to include a new rule. Do not block the barn, or you may experience an unexpected agricultural surprise. Mike grinned. Got a couple inquiries from people saying they want to stay just to see what happens next. Tom shook his head. Long as they park where they're supposed to, I got no problems. Weeks passed, and life on the farm went back to normal. The manure pile slowly shrank as it was put to use in the fields, and the barn doors remained unobstructed. One afternoon, as Tom was finishing up work, he noticed another car pulling into Mike's driveway. The new guests stepped out, stretching their legs, but this time, before they did anything else, they carefully parked in the designated spot, far from the barn. One of them even gave Tom a friendly wave. He nodded back in approval. Some lessons, it seemed, only needed to be taught once. As for Emily, she never came back. But around town, she was still talked about from time to time. The woman who learned the hard way why you don't mess with a farmer's barn. And every time Tom saw someone new pulling up to Mike's place, he couldn't help but grin, tipping his hat at another day well spent. Years later, the story of Tom and the manure-covered car became something of a local legend. It was told and retold at town gatherings, each time with a little more embellishment. Some said Tom had used a bulldozer to bury the car entirely. Others claimed he had enlisted the help of a herd of cows to finish the job. But Tom himself never bothered to correct the rumors. He just smiled, tipped his hat, and went about his work, knowing that sometimes the best way to teach a lesson was to let the story speak for itself. And as for Emily? Well, she became a cautionary tale, a reminder to all city folks that when you're in the country, you'd better respect the land and the people who work it. Because if you don't, you might just find yourself on the wrong end of a farmer's revenge. Months had passed since the infamous manure incident, and life on the farm had settled back into its usual rhythm. Tom continued his daily chores, tending to the animals, maintaining the fields, and occasionally helping out his neighbor Mike with the Airbnb guests. The story of Emily and her manure-covered car had become a local legend, told and retold with increasing embellishment at every town gathering. Tom, however, had moved on, content to let the tale live on without his input. But one crisp autumn morning, as Tom was feeding the chickens, he noticed a familiar car pulling into Mike's driveway. It was a sleek, cherry-red sedan, polished to a mirror's shine. Tom's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? He squinted, trying to get a better look. Sure enough, it was Emily. She stepped out of the car, her blonde bob perfectly styled, her oversized sunglasses perched on her head. She looked around cautiously, as if expecting a manure-covered ambush at any moment. Tom couldn't help but chuckle under his breath. He hadn't expected to see her again, especially not after the scathing Yelp review she'd left and subsequently deleted months ago. Tom decided to keep his distance for now, curious to see how this would play out. He watched as Emily approached Mike's house, her steps hesitant. Mike greeted her at the door, his expression a mix of surprise and amusement. "Emily," Mike said, his tone carefully neutral. "Didn't expect to see you back here." Emily forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I thought I'd give this place another try. I realized I might have overreacted last time." Mike raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. "Well, welcome back. Just remember the rules this time." Emily nodded quickly. "Of course. I'll be on my best behavior." Tom, still watching from a distance, couldn't help but feel a twinge of skepticism. Emily had seemed anything but reasonable during her last visit. He decided to keep an eye on her, just in case. Over the next few days, Emily kept to herself, staying mostly in the guest house and venturing out only to explore the nearby trails. She was careful to park her car in the designated spot, far from Tom's barn. She even waved at him once or twice, though her smiles seemed forced. Tom, for his part, remained cautious. He wasn't sure what had brought Emily back, but he wasn't about to let his guard down. He continued his work, keeping an eye on her from a distance. One afternoon, as Tom was repairing a fence near the edge of his property, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see Emily walking toward him, her hands shoved into the pockets of her designer jacket. She looked nervous, almost apologetic. "Hey," she said, stopping a few feet away. "Can we talk?" Tom straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Sure. What's on your mind?" Emily took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "Look, I know I was difficult last time I was here. I acted entitled, and I didn't respect your property." "I'm sorry." Tom raised an eyebrow, surprised by her apology. He hadn't expected this. "All right," he said slowly. "Thanks for saying that." Emily nodded, looking down at her boots. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since I left. I realized that I was so caught up in my own world that I didn't stop to consider how my actions affected others. I've been trying to be better, but I know I have a long way to go." Tom studied her for a moment, trying to gauge her sincerity. She seemed genuine, but he wasn't ready to let his guard down just yet. "Well, admitting you were wrong is a good first step," he said. "What brought you back here, though? You didn't exactly leave on good terms." Emily sighed. "I guess I wanted to prove to myself that I could do better. And I wanted to apologize to you in person. I know I can't undo what happened, but I hope we can start over." Tom considered her words. He wasn't one to hold grudges, and he appreciated her effort to make amends. "All right," he said finally. "Apology accepted. Just remember, the barn is off limits." Emily smiled, this time more genuinely. "Deal." Over the next few days, Emily made an effort to be more considerate. She helped Mike with small tasks around the guest house, and even offered to assist Tom with some of his farm work. At first, Tom was hesitant, but he soon realized that Emily was serious about making a change. One afternoon, as they were repairing a section of the fence together, Emily turned to Tom. "You know, I've been thinking. I've spent so much of my life in the city, always rushing from one thing to the next. But being out here, it's peaceful. I think I needed this." Tom nodded, understanding what she meant. The farm has a way of putting things in perspective. It's hard work, but it's honest work. And there's something satisfying about seeing the fruits of your labor. Emily smiled. "I'm starting to see that. I think I've been missing out." Tom chuckled. "Well, you're welcome to come back anytime. Just maybe leave the car in the right spot next time." Emily laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh that surprised even herself. "Deal." As Emily's stay came to an end, she found herself reluctant to leave. She had grown fond of the farm, the animals, and even the hard work. But most of all, she had grown fond of the people, Tom, Mike, and the other neighbors who had welcomed her back with open arms. On her last day, Emily approached Tom as he was feeding the chickens. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for giving me a second chance. I know I didn't deserve it, but I'm grateful." Tom smiled, tipping his hat. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Emily. You just have to be willing to take it." Emily nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'll remember that. And I'll be back, if you'll have me." Tom chuckled. You're always welcome here, Emily. Just remember, no parking in front of the barn. Emily laughed, wiping her eyes. I think I've learned my lesson on that one. Emily did return to the farm, not as a guest, but as a friend. She visited often, helping out with the chores and learning the ins and outs of farm life. Over time, she became a familiar face in the community, and her story became a testament to the power of second chances. As for Tom, he continued his work on the farm, content in the knowledge that he had made a difference in someone's life. And every time he saw Emily's red sedan parked in the designated spot, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that some lessons only needed to be taught once. The legend of the manure-covered car lived on, but it was no longer a cautionary tale. Instead, it became a story of redemption, of growth, and of the unexpected friendships that can blossom in the most unlikely of places. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.